John Donne and John Milton, whom we discussed last time, are sometimes classified as either metaphysical poets, or Milton sometimes may be called the precursor of Romanticism or of Classicism, and so on. I deliberately avoided using these literary critical terms because they're somewhat oblique. But still, when speaking about poetry, it's impossible to do without those notions. Classicism, Romanticism, Realism. Classicism usually is associated with the late 17th and the 18th centuries, Romanticism and of the 18th and the first half of the 19th centuries. Then we might speak about realism, modernism, postmodernism, symbolism, and so on. The most important opposition, of course, is between classicism and romanticism. Classicists insisted, in the spirit of the age, that poetry, prose, and generally science should be rational. Intuition is not really significant. Human feelings are not that important. And the idea of poetry, of literature, and of the arts is to understand life from the rational point of view. Also, the significant point was following the classics. Classicists naturally loved ancient Greek and Latin literature, ancient Greek and Latin poetry. And in the most notable attempts to establish the exact rules for writing a text, French classicists suggested the famous three rules: the unity of place, time, and action. And they came to the conclusion that action should take place during just one day, and so on. And there were many other rules to follow. There might be something in this intellectual kind of literature, but as Samuel Johnson rightly remarked, poetry in this case turned out to be a rational argument for something or against something, and these texts should have been better written in prose, because there is very little emotion about them all, and the capacity of poetry to render feelings, to use the metaphorical potential of the language, was completely ignored by such poets as John Dryden, Alexander Pope. These are the most significant representatives of classicism in English. And from this point of view, we should treat those poetic texts not as emotional, intuitive experience of the writers, but an attempt to provide rational argument in the poetic form, which generally would have sounded more appropriate if written in prose. For this reason, classicists may be quite good about following the formal side of poetry. They would have the right amount of syllables and the correct rhymes, but the emotional component was entirely absent. That's why when we think about the 18th century, the main names that come to our minds are not those of poets, but those of the prose writers, simply because the prevailing tendency was to write rational, amusing texts, which, when put in prose, sounded quite appropriate, and when put in poetry, sounded somewhat problematic. And this age of reason, primarily associated, of course, with the French literature, but followed by other representatives of other national literatures, Russian literature included, was followed by the opposite variant of writing poetic texts, in which rationality seemed irrelevant. The poetic texts of this trend were aimed at expressing human emotions, trying to understand human nature. They revealed the interest in the past rather than the present and the future, the interest in the history of a nation, very often very ancient history, the interest in drawing out a character opposed to the society at large. So no restrained emotional, no explicit appeal to the intellect, no interest really in the classical antiquity. All these were the characteristics of Romanticism, which glorified emotion, individualism, the past, the nature, and they preferred the medieval to the classical, which turned to classical literature, ancient Greek and Rome. So the basic difference between these two trends is rationality, the absence of it, the rules to be followed not only in literature but in society, where everything should be rational, in classicism, and disobeying the rules, rejecting them, insisting on the value of an individual. This is something that we may find in Romanticism. It's a very straightforward characteristic, but as volumes have been written on the subject, either we speak about everything that has been written, or we confine ourselves to this kind of opposition. I prefer, of course, the second variant. And in this context, we must think also about the historical reasons which made people write predominantly in one direction, follow one literary trend or the other. And the event, of course, which inspired so many people to turn to the rights of the individual was the famous French Revolution, the year 1789. Many romantically minded people would ignore the atrocities committed by the revolutionaries. They would ignore the political influence so many other countries had on France in order to destabilize the country. They would speak about the right of the individual to resist the rules of the society, and parallels and analogies would be found in the past to glorify the famous French Revolution. For Romantics, it was great surprise and great grief that the ideals of the revolution proved to be so bloody, then the fact that Napoleon became emperor, and then the liberation movement stopped and the aggressive foreign policy in France was adopted. So the historic events turned to be somewhat different from the ideals of Romantics. But still the stress on the value of an individual, his feelings, his irrationality, sometimes the terrible thoughts and terrible deeds a person commits, all these things were characteristic of Romanticism, and they were not to be found in classical writing. I would prefer not to speak in detail, as we have no time, whatever, about the classical period. You may turn to Dryden or to Alexander Pope to see what it was all about. But the good thing about those poets representing classicism was that they not actually initiated the tradition of humorous writing in English. It existed long before then. But they made it a point of their writing. And this tradition was really firmly established in the 18th century, end of the 17th century by Dryden, then by Pope, and by people writing in the same way. Of course, we have humorous writings like Hero and Leander previously. We had Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis, so we can say that at a certain period, suddenly humor appeared. It had been there all along. But it was developed in the 18th century considerably, and then there followed the famous humorous tradition in English literature, which is represented by certain 19th and 20th century writers very brightly. As what we're going to speak about is going to be quite serious, in the remaining part of our lectures now, I will try to amuse you a little bit. Let us turn to the examples of English humor, the illustrations which we find on one of those sheets of papers I have sent to you. Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll, and T.S. Eliot. Of course, this is not classicism, but still it is connected with following the already existing folk traditions and the traditions established in the 18th century. Just some pieces of poetry to amuse you. I think everyone knows Edward Lear with his limericks, a form he invented by himself. The first, the second, the first lines are rhymed, the third and the fourth are rhymed between each other. And after the initial statement, there is a grotesque development of it. And so we have such amusing texts as, "There was an old man of Peru who never knew what he should do. So he tore off his hair and behaved like a bear, that intrinsic old man of Peru. There was a young lady of Portugal whose ideas were excessively nautical. She climbed up a tree to examine the sea, but declared she would never leave Portugal." Quite absurd, but amusing. And people follow this tradition very often by writing limericks of their own. "There was an old man on a hill who seldom, if ever, stood still. He ran up and down in his grandmother's gown, which adorned that old man on a hill. There was an old lady of Chertsey who made a remarkable curtsy. She twirled round and round till she sunk underground, which distressed all the people of Chertsey. There was an old man of the West who wore a pale plum-colored vest. When they said, 'Does it fit?' he replied, 'Not a bit,' that uneasy old man of the West. There was a young lady of Norway who casually sat on a doorway. When the door squeezed her flat, she exclaimed, 'What of that?' This courageous young lady of Norway. There was an old person of Basin whose presence of mind was amazing. He purchased a steed, which he rode at full speed, and escaped from the people of Basin. There was an old man of Cape Horn who wished he had never been born, so he sat on a chair till he died of despair, the dolorous man of Cape Horn." And there are many more poems of this kind. If you feel like amusing yourself, you will probably enjoy reading Edward Lear's limericks. Lewis Carroll is primarily known as the author of Alice and Wonderland and Alice behind the looking glass. But here we have an example of a poetic text of Lewis Carroll, which was a parody of many genres. It's a story of how several people travel on a ship because they're hunting the snark. It's not explained in the text who the snark is, exactly what kind of animal probably it is, but there are a lot of characteristics of this being. And here, Lewis Carroll, of course, makes fun of mystical texts, mainly Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Rime of Ancient Mariner. He makes fun of the stories of people traveling, and this may date back even to Geoffrey Chaucer, and many other genres and traditions are subjected to humorous reconsideration in his text. I will give you just some examples. Maybe you will feel one day like reading this really remarkable piece of absurd, humorous poetry. So several people are traveling, and one of them is the bellman, the person who rings a bell on the ship. And here comes the characteristic of the bellman. The bellman himself, they all praise to the skies. Such a carriage, such ease and such grace, such solemnity too. No, one could see he was wise the moment one looked in his face. He had bought a large map representing the sea, without the least vestige of land, and the crew were much pleased when they found it to be a map they could all understand. Ну, тут явно пародия на рациональность классической как раз литературы, когда все точно описывается. Ну и вот мы видим, что у этого звонаря, так сказать, была карта, которой было очень удобно пользоваться, потому что там не было вообще ни кусочка суши на этой карте не описано. Там была сплошная вода, и всем очень понравилось, потому что все могли эту карту понимать. Ну, другой вопрос, что карта была абсолютно бесполезна. Вот тут еще и the rationality of the previous age is being made fun of. What's the good of Mercatus, North Poles and Equators, tropic zones and meridian lines? So the bellman would cry, and the crew would reply, they are merely conventional sayings. All other maps are such shapes with their islands and capes, but we've got our brave captain to thank. So the crew would protest that he's bought us the best, a perfect and absolute blank. This was charming, no doubt, but they shortly found out that the captain they trusted so well had only one notion for crossing the ocean, and that was to tingle his bell. Следующее. The Baker's Tale. Ну, это вот как раз в романтическом духе, это прям Вордсворт сплошной. My father and mother were honest, though poor. Skip all that, cried the bellman in haste. If it once becomes dark, there is no chance of a snark. We've hardly a minute to waste. Ну, пекарь собирается рассказать длинную историю, на что капитан говорит, что уже смеркается, нам надо успеть поймать снарка. Ну, продолжайте, естественно. I skip 40 years, said the baker in tears, and proceed without further remark to the day when you took me aboard of your ship to help you in hunting the snark. A dear uncle of mine, after whom I was named, remarked when I bade him farewell, "Oh, skip your dear uncle," the bellman exclaimed as he angrily tingled his bell. He remarked to me then, said that mildest of men, "If your snark be a snark, that is right. Fetch it home by all means. You may serve it with greens, and it's handy for striking a light. You may seek it with symbols and seek it with care. You may hunt it with forks and hope. You may threaten its life with a railway share. You may charm it with smiles and soap. That's exactly the method that Bellman told in a hasty parenthesis crate. The Bellman bold in a hasty parenthesis crate. That's exactly the way I have always been told that the capture of snarks should be tried. But oh, beamish nephew, beware of the day, if your snark be a boojum, for then you will softly and suddenly vanish away and never be met with again. Значит, уточнение, что такое снарк. Если снарк, то им удобно, и спички зажигать можно. Но если этот снарк окажется буджимом, то это будет ужасно. It is this that oppresses my soul when I think of my uncle's last words. And my heart is like nothing so much as a bowl brimming over with quivering curds. It is this. We have had that before, the bellman indignantly said. And the baker replied, let me say it once more. It is this that I dread. I engage with the snark every night after dark in a dreamy, delirious fight. I serve it with grins in those shadowy scenes, and I use it for striking a light. But if ever I meet with the boojum, that day, in a moment of this I'm sure, I shall softly and suddenly vanish away, and the notion I cannot endure. And a lot of other poetic lines of the same kind, a parody of everything, of classicism with its rationality, of romanticism with the remembrance of the dear uncle, of mystics as part of romanticism, and of traveling stories, the way they go back to Chaucer, for instance. So, quite amusing texts, both absurd in their content and quite rich from the literary point of view, because very often they may be treated as parodies of the previous or the coexisting literary traditions. And an example of the 20th century humorous writing, the famous text by T.S. Eliot, on the basis of which the famous musical was made, the Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. There are a lot of poems devoted to cats, and this is the initial one where the author speaks about naming of cats. Again, quite an absurd subject, but he is speaking about it in a very serious manner, which makes the text doubly amusing and absurd. The idea is that cats, each of the cats, should have three different names. One of them may be an ordinary name, another one is more exotic, and the other one is the really significant last name of a cat, which the cat itself would never mention, but of which the cat is constantly thinking. Quite amusing again. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I am as mad as a hatter when I tell you a cat must have three different names. First of all, there's the name that the family use daily, such as Peter, Augustus, Alonzo, or James, such as Victor or Jonathan, or George or Bill Bailey, all of them sensible everyday names. There are fancier names if you think they sound sweeter, some for the gentlemen, some for the dames, such as Plato, Admetus, Electra, Demeter, but all of them sensible everyday names. But I tell you, a cat needs a name that's particular, a name that's peculiar and more dignified. Else, how can he keep up his tail perpendicular, or spread out his whiskers, or cherish his pride? Of names of this kind, I can give you a quorum, such as Mancostrip, Quaxer, or Caricapat, such as Bomballerina, or else Jelly Lorem, names that never belong to more than one cat. But above and beyond, there is still one name left. But above and beyond, there is still one name left over, And that is the name that you never will guess, the name that no human research can discover, but the cat himself knows and will never confess. When you notice a cat in profound meditation, the reason I tell you is always the same. His mind is engaged in a rapt contemplation of the thought, of the thought, of the thought of his name. His ineffable, effable, and ineffable, deep and inscrutable singular name. So that's one collection of texts, quite humorous, all of them. And a very interesting example of a text which is hugely humorous, sometimes frivolous, on the verge of decency or indecency, as the case may be. George Gordon Byron's Don John, in which he naturally follows Venus and Adonis and other texts of this tradition. Pushkin, as we understand, in his Eugene Onegin, imitated both poems by Byron, his Don John and his Childe Harold, quite protracted texts which gave him inspiration. And when we speak about George Gordon Byron, mainly we think about his romantic texts, and some readers would even say that the texts he wrote were basically mediocre, and the only thing that made him so significant for the reading public was his scandalous reputation. We remember about him becoming a lord, then leading quite a disorderly kind of life, having a child by his half-sister, having many sexual relations, finally being forced to leave England, fighting for the freedom of Greece or whatever he was fighting for, just to display his temperament, and then finally dying at the age of 36 in Greece and becoming a kind of national hero for this country. So the reputation was really exotic. A Byronic character appeared in literature. The ideas of the freedom of an individual, romanticism, it was all there. And people tended to regard Byron as someone equal to his characters. That was probably right. But the general idea was, among some readers, that Byron became so popular, not because he wrote anything particularly interesting, but because his scandalous life, full of adventures, inspired so many people to read his text. But in my opinion, it's a kind of exaggeration, to put it mildly, or, when put more categorically, the gross misinterpretation and under-evaluation of the poet's works. There were a lot of serious texts he wrote, which may be treated as the first-rate poetry. And this humorous text of Byron concerning Don Juan, which can be rightly considered a masterpiece of English humorous poetry. It's the story about a young gentleman. First comes his ancestry description of his mother, who was learned, of his father, who was irresponsible, and then his traveling again, getting to various exotic places. The language is incredibly rich, versatile. The author is very witty, and I hope that if you turn to this kind of English poetry, you will enjoy Byron's texts. Dying interstate, John was so air to a chancery suit and messages and letters, which, with a long minority and care, promised to turn out well in proper hands. Inez, the mother of Don Juan, became sole guardian, which was fair, and answered but to nature's just demands. An only son, left with an only mother, is brought up much more wisely than another. Sagest of women, even of widows she, resolved that June should be quite a paragon, and worthy of the noblest pedigree. His sire was of Castile, his dam of Aragon. Then for accomplishments of chivalry, in case our lord the king should go to war again, he learned the arts of riding, fencing, gunnery, and how to scale a fortress or a nunnery. But that which Donna Inez most desired, and saw into herself each day before all, the learned tutors whom for him she hired, was that his breeding should be strictly moral. Much into all his studies she inquired, and so they were submitted first to her all. Arts, sciences, no branch was made a mystery to John's eyes, excepting natural history. The languages, especially the dead, the sciences, and most of all the abstruse, the arts, at least all such as could be said to be the most remote from common use. In all this he was much and deeply read, but not a page of anything that's loose or hints continuation of the species was ever suffered, lest he should grow vicious. Making fun of classical education, Don Juan was taught all the things which were completely irrelevant in real life, and all references to sexual affairs were carefully removed from his curriculum by his doting mother. His classic studies made a little puzzle because of filthy loves of gods and goddesses, who in the earlier ages raised a bustle but never put on pantaloons of bodices. His reverend tutors had at times a tussle, and for their Aeneids, Iliads, and Odysseys were forced to make an odd sort of apology, for Donna Inez dreaded the mythology. Again, classical education, which could have been providing moral instruction, but occasionally it was providing immoral instruction. And the mother, the doting mother, was quite shocked at the perspective of her son learning about the uglier sides of life, but this could not be helped. Ovid's rake, as half his verses show him, Anacreon's morals were still worth sample. Catullus scarcely has a decent poem. I don't think Sappho's owed a good example, although Longinus tells us there is no hymn where this sublime soul's force on wings more ample. But Virgil's songs are pure, except that horrid one, beginning with Formosum Pastor Corridor. And so on and so forth. If you feel so inclined, you might read George Gordon Byron's humorous texts. I tried to advertise him. So English classic poetry is very rich in humorous texts. It would be wrong to consider, for example, Edward Lear as the father of the genre, because Byron, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Pope, they were all writing before him. So the tradition was age-long, and if you enjoy this kind of literature, you will find a lot of amusing material here. Now we return to the more serious and sometimes terribly serious examples of literature. We return to our metaphysical poets. And again, when we speak about John Donne or T.S. Eliot, as metaphysical poets those who thought about philosophy, about the dialectical nature of life, about beauty and ugliness, about beauty not necessarily being associated with goodness and ugliness sometimes being associated with goodness, we see that these people were terribly serious about considering various sides of human nature, some of them not immediately obvious, and some of them interpreted from a paradoxical point of view. As there had never been a group of people who would call themselves metaphysical poets, in contrast to romanticists, it's on the one hand a very engaging preoccupation to try and invent a category that would characterize a certain group of people. But in the absence of a clear-cut definition, everyone who was one way or another engaged in philosophy may be awarded the title. And William Shakespeare for his Phoenix and the Turtle, and Robert Southwell for his poems, and John Donne, very naturally, may be called metaphysical, which is sometimes done by various critics. But if we extend the notion so much, very often it loses any coherence, simply because when everybody is metaphysical, then it means that everything is metaphysical. So the term is used loosely, and the interest in philosophy and the inability to accept the traditional truths as formulated, for example, later or previously, depending on whom we're considering, by classicism. These may be called the characteristic traits of metaphysics. And here we may think of William Blake, although he's never classified as a metaphysical poet, as a representative of the genre. We may speak about T.S. Eliot from the same point of view, not already in connection with the humorous writings, but in connection with his very dark and pessimistic view of life, which is not necessarily the key characteristic of a metaphysical poet, but at least some doubts about the value of traditional values and the loneliness of a person in this eschatological sense, they're all present in those metaphysical poems. People love William Blake. Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience, the way they were later not actually imitated, but probably continued by Josip Brodsky, they all go back to this metaphysical tradition and the philosophy displayed by Blake, again, is the readiness to accept the opposite and not necessarily optimistic views of human life. So we're William Blake with his Songs of Innocence, Songs of Experience. To mercy, pity, peace, and love all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God, our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress Praise to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form, in heathen, Turk or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. It's not actually Blake's view of life, it's the way he shows how innocent people would treat life. And then Songs of Experience, quite a different mood. Little fly, thy summer's play, my thoughtless hand has brushed away. Am not I a fly like thee, or art not thou a man like me? For I dance and drink and sing till some blind hand shall brush my wing. If thought is life and strength and breath, and the want of thought is death, then I am a happy fly, if I live or if I die. Again, this is a song from Songs of Experience. When the voices of children are heard in the green, and whisperings are in the dale, the days of my youth rise fresh in my mind, my face turns green and pale. Then come home, my children, the sun is gone down, and the dews of night arise. Your spring and your day are wasted in play, and your winter and night in disguise. So, not exactly an optimistic nurse, because she is producing a song of experience. And again, Holy Thursday from Songs of Innocence. 'Twas a holy Thursday, the innocent faces clean, the children walking two and two in red and blue and green. Grey-headed beetles walked before, with wands as white as snow, till into the high dome of poles they, like Thames waters, flow. Oh, what a multitude they seemed, these flowers of London town! Seated in companies they sit, with radiance all their own. The hum of multitudes was there, but multitudes of lambs, thousands of little boys and girls, raising their innocent hands. Now like a mighty wind they raised to heaven the voice of song, or like harmonious thunderings the seats of heaven among. Beneath them sit the aged men, wise guardians of the poor. Then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. William Blake was not very stable emotionally. He led a very lonely life, suffered from bouts of depression, wrote books very much in the tradition of Edmund Spenser, Shakespeare's older contemporary, like the Book of Tell. This was quite a popular genre, this mysterious kind of writing. I wouldn't allow myself any evaluative judgments here. Some people may like, some people may dislike his poetry, but of course he is recognized as a great classic of English literature, and my purpose here was just to give you an idea of what his texts are like. Maybe some of you would find reading him interesting. And one of the last examples we have of this kind of metaphysical poetry, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, a text connected with the experiences of the First World War. Wasteland, бесплодная, опустевшая земля, the burial of the dead, the part of the text is called quite pessimistic, accepting the fact that human life lasts only for a brief while and then follows the afterlife, of which we know nothing. So metaphysical, but in this sense we may call Shakespeare metaphysical, with to be or not to be, and romantics would say that to be or not to be is romanticism. So It's not so much the literary trends that matter, but having some knowledge of the trends, it becomes easier, of course, to understand the poetic text. But trends are all right, but texts are still more important. And it's the question of enjoyment, first of all. And then it's the question of learning more about the author and the period, not the other way about. If you dislike the text, it's very unlikely that the knowledge of the historical facts will change your mind. But if you like a poem, of course, you feel like reading something else by the same author. So, just an example from T.S. Eliot, much later than Blake, why it's necessary to speak about T.S. Eliot and not just Eliot. It's because we have in the 17th century a woman who was writing under the pen name George Eliot, a woman using the male masculine name. That's why, to keep on the safe side, to make sure we don't confound the two authors, Thomas Stearns Eliot is always mentioned as T.S. Eliot. So, the burial of the dead. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger Sea, with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar keine Russen, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. And when we were children staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Mary, Mary, hold on tight, and down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter. So some seemingly rational ideas combined with the reminiscences of the younger years and even elements of the German language are introduced to show the childhood experiences, which included traveling. And then after this introductory part, not terribly thoughtful, not terribly philosophical, but sometimes difficult to understand, comes an obvious masterpiece, the essence of metaphysical poetry. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of the stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Very gloomy, very expressive, very metaphysical, no rhyme, problematic images, difficult to interpret, and the general scary impression, scaring, terrifying impression the text leaves. These are the characteristic features of this metaphysical line in T.S. Eliot's writings. Again, some of you might enjoy him, some of you may find him not terribly attractive. It depends. So, in that mixed manner. I spoke about classicism, I spoke about metaphysical poetry, I spoke about humorous writings covering the long period of English classic poetry, classicism associated with the 18th century but having predecessors and followers, metaphysical poetry traditionally starting with John Donne, but it's possible to include Shakespeare's texts, some of them, and John Milton, not exactly, but sometimes. And Robert Southwell, they may be included in the list of those metaphysical poets, later to be followed by T.S. Eliot. So quite a mixed company, but it's possible to think of a unifying feature. It's another matter whether this unifying feature is significant and whether the similarities between the writers really explain something about their works, or whether the works should be studied separately and the writers should be studied separately from each other, because still there is very little difference that the exact grouping would make. But again, it depends on your tastes and your ideas of what academic work is like, whether categorization on the basis of a unifying feature, just one feature, is in any way productive. I am here just to explain how things of this kind are done, rather than to advertise this or that approach. Texts may be studied separately, they may be studied together. If it helps you to understand the uniqueness of a particular text and the similarities between them, you are very welcome to make this kind of investigation. And now, by elimination, we get to this very productive period in the history of English poetry connected with Romanticism. Generally, there are two great periods only: Elizabethan literature connected with drama, when many people worked within a particular genre with many outstanding achievements. Not only Shakespeare, but his contemporaries like Ben Jonson, John Fletcher to a certain extent, John Marston, and many others. So, Christopher Marlowe, of course. So this was the time when writings proliferated. This genre of drama was really raised to enormous heights. Of course, there were inferior authors, second-rate authors, and some texts of the great authors were not particularly bright, but it was a very rich tradition represented by quite a number of original and talented writers, some of them writers of genius like William Shakespeare. That's the first period that is really remarkable in English poetry, because it's difficult to equate Elizabethan poetry, for example, with the 14th century literature solely represented by John Gower, Geoffrey Chaucer, and William Langland. Too few authors. The texts are not very protracted and voluminous, so the writers were there. Men of considerable literary talent were there, but it's impossible to equate them with the literary period, with the period in literary history like Elizabethan drama. Then we have a significant 18th century phenomenon connected with English novels, later to be followed in the 19th century by Dickens, Thackeray, Trollope, and other people, but it's not poetry. And the second very significant period in the development of English literature with respect to poetry was, of course, Romanticism. So now please have a look at the four sheets of paper we are left with, beginning with Robert Burns, then Alfred Tennyson, then William Wordsworth, or rather William Wordsworth, then Alfred Tennyson, and then Algernon Charles Swinburne. 4 pages, densely printed. Have a look, please, and then I will begin commenting on these texts. Now we come to Romanticism. It's much easier to define than those metaphysical poets, for example, because we can lean upon our Russian tradition, and we know very well what Romanticism meant in our Russian tradition. So, emotional aspect is significant, individual aspect, freedom of human spirit, glorification of the past, glorification of the nature, scornful attitude to the rational perception of life and to various rules and canons imposed in literature or in life. And romantic poets were, of course, a very mixed group of people, some of them interested in the medieval history, the historic past, some of them interested in modern events like Byron and his friends, so to speak. But there are some unifying features, of course, and they are connected precisely with this reaction towards the rationalism of classicism and the idea of irrationality, of freedom, was quite significant for Romantics. We begin first with the writers who are unified by the fact that they were not born in England, they were writers of Great Britain, but they were either of Scottish origin, like Robert Burns and Walter Scott, and of the Irish origin, like Thomas More. Of the three, only Robert Burns wrote in Scottish dialect. Some elements of the Scottish language were introduced, which makes it somewhat difficult to understand his texts, although he is recognized as a great writer of lyrical poetry and he worked in other genres. It's not at all difficult to understand Walter Scott and Thomas More because they wrote in our modern standard English. So we are grouping them here according to this national principle, and there is also the interest in the individual aspects of a human's life, and they are all interested in the heroic past of their respective countries, Scotland and Ireland. So Robert Burns, very popular in our country, due to some songs included in popular films. No, doesn't matter. There are some beautiful songs. And a text that may be regarded as the hymn of Scotland, for instance. Should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should all acquaintance be forgot and old lang syne? For old lang syne, my Joe, for old lang syne, we'll take a cup of kindness yet for old lang syne. Familiar from Mashak's translation. A whistle and I'll come to you, my lad. A whistle and I'll come to you, my lad. Though father and mother and all should go mad, a whistle and I'll come to you, my lad. Then the text we know from Рязанов's film, «В полях под снегом и дождем». Нет, тут еще тут мы знаем. Нет, это другое. Это, по-моему, Гребенщиков. Words are on the cold blast, on yonder lea, on yonder lea. My plaided the angry art, I'd shelter thee, I'd shelter thee. Or did misfortunes but a storm around the blow, around the blow? Thy shield should be my bosom, to share it all, to share it all. Полях под снегом и дождем, мой милый друг, мой бедный друг, тебя укрыл бы я плащом от зимних юг, и если мука суждена тебе судьбой, готов я скоро твою до дна делить с тобой, делить с тобой. Were I in the wildest waste, so black and bare, the desert were a paradise, if thou wert there, if thou wert there. Were I monarch of the globe, with thee to reign, the brightest jewel in my crown would be my queen, would be my queen. Beautiful lyrical poetry, not complicated conceptually. Если б дали мне в удел весь шар земной, с каким блаженством я владел, тобой одной. Oh, my love's like a red, red rose that newly sprung in June. Oh, my life's like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I, and I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas can dry. В горах мое сердце, my heart in the highlands. Нет, вот тут как раз в моей душе покоя нет, весь день я жду кого-то, без сна встречаю я рассвет и все из-за кого-то, сомнения в кого-то и так далее. My heart is there, I dare not tell, my heart is there for somebody. I could wake a winter night for the sake of somebody. A moment somebody, okay, for somebody. I could range the world around for the sake of somebody. Russian text, I think, is much better. And then comes, my heart's in the highlands. My heart is not here. My heart's in the highlands, a chasing the deer, a chasing the wild deer and following the road. My heart's in the highlands, wherever I go. Farewell to the highlands, farewell to the north, the birthplace of valor, the country of words. Wherever I wander, wherever I rove, the hills of the highlands, forever I love. And so on. So if you are interested, I hope that this brief introduction of Robert Burns will inspire you later. Walter Scott was interested, as the people dictated it, in writing quite protracted texts and not lyrical poems in the Robert Burns or Thomas More tradition, which makes him sometimes quite a dull reading, but still some texts are quite beautiful, and if some of you feel like reading long and not very eventful texts, you may turn to poems of Walter Scott, narrative poems, and probably enjoy them. By tenfold odds oppressed at length, despite his struggles and his strength, he took 100 mortal wounds, as mute as fox amongst mangling hounds. A hero dying in his opposition to the enemies. And when he died, his parting groan had more of laughter than of mirth. They gazed as when a lion dies, and hunters scarcely trust their eyes, but bend their weapons on the slain, lest the grim king would rouse again. Then blow and insult some renewed, and from the trunk the head had hewed, but Bassil's voice the deed forbade. A mantle over the corse he laid. Fell as he was in act and mind, he left no bow the hunt behind. Then give him for a soldier need, a soldier's cloak for wine and shield. No more of death and dying pine, no more of trump and bugle clang. Though through the sounding woods they can come, banner and bugle, trump and drum, and so on. So if we are interested in this kind of text, we might read it. And the last example from this collection of national poets, Thomas More. We had an example from him when we were just speaking at the very first lecture of the masterpieces of English poetry. I wouldn't begin speaking about him now, because it requires obviously more than 2 minutes of discussion. So next time we cover Thomas More and the remaining 3 pages with William Wordsworth, George Gordon Byron, Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, Algernon Charles Swinburne, Christina Rossetti, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So thank you very much for your kind attention.